Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Our mission is to see a world well led. And our strategy to get there? To empower leaders like you to lead every day. So let's get to work.
Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Glad you're with us this week. We have a new president as of last week. Maybe I should say we have a new old president. A new president.
Well, he is old and he's new, right? He's the old new president, right?
So I'm Randy Gravitt. Got Mark Miller here with me. We're going to talk Trump 2.0 today, and I think there's something, Mark. I'm excited about this because I think there's some things that we need to think about for leaders today. So I don't know if you had a chance to watch the inauguration or not, but
I saw highlights.
Did you know that
I saw the highlights?
Did you know that I think the first inauguration goes all the way back to? I mean, they've been doing this since George Washington. It's been happening over and over. One of the things I think that makes our country so cool, you know, the transfer of power. It's a cool thing, and so. But I mean,
another bit of.
Go ahead.
I was going to say another bit of history is this is only the second time that a president has had a second non-consecutive term. The last time it happened was in 1885 and 1893 with Grover Cleveland.
I was going to say you're going to need
so there's another bit of history.
Yeah, you got to remind me who that was. So Grover Cleveland's the guy, huh? Okay, that's good.
Yep.
I should know my presidential history maybe a little better. You know, my wife's a fifth grade teacher. She's probably teaching the presidents back in the day. And when she was teaching, so she'd be disappointed that I didn't know that it was Grover Cleveland. But Donald Trump, here we go, second time around. And as you think about it, I'm sure there's probably some things that he'll want to do differently or whatever. But it made me start thinking about leaders, and I'm specifically in this situation he's going into. He's walking into a situation where just only a little over half the country, I guess, wanted him to be there. The other half wanted somebody else to be there. And so all kind of situations that leaders walk into when they they go into a new role. And that's really what I wanted to talk about today. I want us to, people may think, why are y'all talking about this? But I think there's some dots that we connect because there's all kind of new situations that really every leader probably walks into new situations. I know you have, I have. We'll talk about some of those.
Sure.
But this is going to be a fun.
But before we go there, what kind of advice do you have for the president? I mean, we can't just move past it that quickly. Well, if Trump watches this podcast, what is it you want him to hear?
Well, I will say I want him to, if nothing else, I want him to lead well. I mean, if I could pick anything, we talk about it all the time. The whole deal is about leadership. And when leaders do a great job, it ends up being good for all the people who are following, so to speak. And when leaders mess it up, it ends up being a mess. And so I would say my advice would just, lead well. We're going to talk about some specifics here in a few minutes, but I don't know. You got any advice? I mean, I'd love the idea of him listening to the podcast here. It'd be great. But.
Well, I would hope and pray that he will maintain an others first mindset. Now, I know some folks listening might say that's not been his track record. I'm not here to judge, but going forward, you and I know the best leaders always think others first. And I think that would be my first request of not only Trump, but any leader moving into a new role.
Yeah, I think I would pile on that. And I'll actually use another phrase that we've used in the past, the old hunger for wisdom phase. I mean, I just can't imagine being the president. I mean, it just feels like it's a really big, hard, task and job, whatever you want to call it. And I mentioned last week in our habits, on our episode, habit number one for me was to pray. And I used the quote from Lincoln where when Abraham Lincoln was president, there's stories about how he would pray and his old quote, I've been so overwhelmed by the task at hand, I've been driven to my knees. And I would encourage Trump to not only pray, but to surround himself with good people and, seek all the wisdom you can get. I always think the wise choice is the best choice. And so I think we would all feel more secure if we're being led by somebody who's wise than we would by somebody who's not wise, whether it's the president or, in our family or wherever. I mean, wisdom, but I love your challenge to think others first. That's, the servant leaders always are the most impactful leaders. I believe that too. So that's good. Okay. So why does this matter to our audience? Like, why are we even inauguration, all that kind of stuff? You got a thought here for the audience? Because again, we got all kind of different leaders that are listening.
Sure. And I think you began the setup just a moment ago. Most leaders throughout their career will find themselves in a new leadership opportunity, a new leadership position. Maybe it's within your organization, or maybe you move from one organization to another. And each and every one of those presents a unique opportunity. So as you said, I think it'd be good for us to think beyond the presidency. Most of us aren't ever going to be the leader of the free world, but we will have people, projects, and resources that we are asked to steward. And so when we go into those new situations, I think there's some principles and some practices that you and I have both validated over about 75, 80 years of leadership. And I think we might share those for any leader moving into a new opportunity or a new role or a new position.
That's great. All right. So let's see if we can give some advice to new leaders. And I want to start with a thought here. I know you've actually got some experience with this, but we're going to hear in the news, I guess, over the next few days, weeks, whatever. We've already heard a little bit about it. The 100-day agenda. Anytime a president comes in, we hear this almost question of what are they going to do in their first 100 days. And I don't know that 100 days is some magic. I mean, it's just a round number. I guess that's why that's been chosen. But I think when we go into a new role, there is some power in really setting out, like, what are we trying to do as we start something? I remember years ago, I think I was at a meeting maybe with you when Horst Schultz, remember the Ritz-Carlton Horst, he made a statement. He said an employee's, and this is, by the way, if you have new employees, this is something you might want to even think about. But he said an employee's first 40 hours literally might be the most important 40 hours of a 40-year career. If they had a 40-year career, he still would say those first 40 hours would be their most important 40 hours. And that made me think when I heard him say that. And the same thing might be true here as we think about, an agenda, when you start something, 100-day agenda, 40 hours, first week, whatever. I think the principle here is it's important to get off to a good start. And so what would you say, Mark, to that person that, and I know you've actually worked with some leaders and talked about this. Share some of that with us.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a fantastic question because there is that conventional wisdom, and it's conventional wisdom for a reason. It often makes sense for a leader to have a 100-day agenda, because what it means is that you're prepared, you're thoughtful, you're hopefully purposeful and strategic, and there are a lot of good things that come from it. It also can signal to an organization perhaps new priorities, new strategy. So I understand all that. But as you mentioned, I've actually worked with some senior leaders to create 100-day agendas. And in one particular case, I helped a leader create one, a senior leader. And at the last minute, he decided not to use it. And I said, that's fine. Like, okay, let's talk about that. I want to learn something here. And he said, I decided that my initial message was going to be continuity, not change. Now, that's a judgment call on the part of that leader. And what he believed to be true was that the organization there was enough angst and anxiety that they needed that moment of pause and stability. He did not forfeit his right, privilege, or opportunity to make changes culturally and strategically. He just decided to extend that well beyond 100 days. He although he never said this, it felt like he was then living in about a 3-year agenda. So I think it matters. But the principle here is when you do go into a new opportunity, to be purposeful, to be thoughtful, to be planful, to be as strategic as possible. And think about it. Are there some messages you need to send early and often? Great. Create that 100-day agenda for change. But maybe wisdom, as you mentioned a moment ago, would be to move at a little slower pace. One quick example of that was when Satya Nadella took over at Microsoft. He was an insider, and he had some real specific things he wanted to change about the culture, but he went on a listening tour that took almost a year before he announced the changes he wanted to make. So be purposeful, be thoughtful, be strategic, and chart your course carefully. I think that's macro counsel. I know we're going to get into some specific things, but I think it does start with that mindset. What are you trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's great. That's always a great question, no matter what we're doing. I remember I've had a little bit of experience with some new things. It's happened over and over for you and me both probably, but I mean, several times in my journey, I've had that. And I remember one of the craziest ones was back. I was just a kid, really mid-20s, and I had an opportunity to be hired as a high school girls basketball coach. It's pretty crazy because I had never coached high school basketball at the time. I had actually spent a year when I was in college. My senior year, I got hurt. I was playing tennis, and our tennis coach at our college happened to be the women's basketball coach. And so I had a scholarship, and he said, you keep your scholarship. He said, come basically help me fold towels for the women's basketball team. And I ended up basically being a high level a scholarship manager, I guess you'd say, for a few games toward the end of that season. And I watched a little bit, learned a little bit, but that was my whole experience. I played some basketball growing up, but other than that, I didn't know what I was doing, walking into. And so I go into and I get hired for this job, and I find out walking in, Mark, that they had not won a game the year before, which I guess was good and bad. I was walking in a little bit to a mess, but I think when leaders walk into stuff, oftentimes when we get a new opportunity, it's because the old opportunity wasn't going the way it needed to be, or something's broken. I mean, it's like, hey, can you come fix this kind of thing? And so I remember the how that felt. I also and we can unpack any of that you want to, but I also remember years later when I started our company that what is Lead Every Day now, it was Integrate, 10, 11 years ago. I remember doing that, and I had been coaching for a while before that. And I felt, at one point I don't know what I'm doing as a coach. Then you learn what you're doing as a coach. Was actually, we were pretty successful after a while. And then you end up in this, new thing. And every single time, the point I want to make here is every single time it was like I felt this, what I'm going to describe as leadership vertigo. I don't even know if that's the right word or not, but the equilibrium, the dynamic, it's new. You don't know what you're doing. You're walking into something. You don't know the people. You don't know for basketball, I didn't know the fans, didn't know the parents, didn't know the players. For leadership, the clients. I mean, it's just, you're a lot of times you're walking into stuff you just don't feel comfortable. And I think the really best leaders, the ones who do best when they do something new, is they go in with this mindset. I'm going to be comfortable being uncomfortable. I mean, I think there's some of that is really important. And so, I can think.
Let me jump in here. You've challenged me that's certainly true in these new opportunities, but I would expand that and say the best leaders are always comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because they're pushing, they're striving, they're trying to accomplish things that have never been accomplished before. They're trying to bring the best out of people and an organization, and that involves hard things and tough decisions. And so I don't want to miss the fact that, yes, the new leaders got to be comfortable being uncomfortable, but I hope that we're all living in a perpetual state of I'm not sure about this. This is new. This is different. This is going to require new and different strategies or new and different skills. I think the best leaders are always uncomfortable.
Well, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think if our goal is to be comfortable, we just need to sit in a beanbag all the time. And that's, that's not the goal of life, right? That's a good call out. But I think oftentimes when you go into something new, that's when you really feel like, okay, the plates are moving and the things are, what am I even doing here? I remember a couple of times through my career at different situations, I've taken something on. I've literally thought, what in the world am I doing? You kind of feel like a duck out of water at first. And so there are some things, we'll get to that in a second, that you can do that I think will help with that. How about you? I mean, you think of some times, I know you've had several opportunities to do new things, new situations.
Well,
some of those.
Yeah, that's being gracious. I was introduced at an event not long ago by one of my colleagues as a guy who couldn't hold down a job. There is some truth to that, but over a 45-year career, I had the opportunity to move into new leadership positions, I don't know, 6, 8, 10, 12 times over those years. And you mentioned walking into a mess. I did not walk into many. I'm very thankful to say that, but I loved it when I did, because then the next steps were often intuitive and even perhaps obvious. But I think what we're about to give people is going to help them regardless of the level of function or dysfunction. And I think it'll help them regardless of whether there's that little bit of discomfort or outright vertigo. And I think that's why these next few tactics will help you get on the right path. So let's unpack a few things for them.
That's great. Let's jump into it. So if I'm in this situation, I don't know what to do. Let's start with one that I like. And I know you talk about this a lot as well. I think you got to identify the wins. You want to know, like, what am I, you said it a minute ago, what am I trying to accomplish, but how am I going to know if I'm successful or not? I think that's a huge starting place here for us. If we're going into something new, the first thing I would want to do is, even to the level of, and let's make this as practical as possible. What am I accountable for? Oftentimes if you're the owner, you still may have a board or somebody, that you've set up around you, or you've got stakeholders, whatever. You most of us have somebody that we're accountable to. And I would start with, what am I accountable for? And then who am I accountable to? I mean, those questions to me go hand in hand. And I also like, Mark, when we think about identifying wins, I also like having a scorecard, having a scoreboard. I mean, we're in the middle of NFL playoffs, going on. We're actually going to talk about the Super Bowl here in a couple of weeks. But what makes these games so exciting these past few weekends is the fact that they're keeping score. I mean, if there was no score,
right,
they'd just be practice or whatever. And most people don't show up to watch practice. I mean, it probably happens. But what makes those stadiums fill up is that, there's a competition going on. And I think if we're going to really be successful, we need to know, how are we measuring success? How do we measure, are we winning or are we not winning? And you said earlier, we may have 3 years, or we may have a year, or we may have 30 years. I mean, we don't know how long we're going to be at whatever place. But I think, what are those first early wins that we would want? Let's go back to our 100-day agenda, our first 40 hours. What are those first wins that we would want to? So when I think about identifying wins, some of those things come to mind. And I would encourage anybody who's listening, anytime you go into something new, give some thought to those questions. I know you've got some other things you would add to that, identifying the wins, but let's hear your side of that.
Well, just let me, I think you said it really, really well. Let me be sure. I think it's wins plural. There's probably more than one win. Now, you may have an expectation from the organization to hit a key metric, and certainly then that would become a priority. But I rarely see situations where it's only a win, because in part, you've got your organizational goals, your team goals, those types of things, and you've got personal aspirations. What do you want to win? How do you want to win in this role or in this assignment? Is it in fact preparing you for something else? And you mentioned you don't know how long you're going to be in an organization. Sometimes you don't know how long you're going to be in a role, but sometimes you do. I had a senior leader come to me one time, and he was seeking some counsel about his goals and priorities in a new role. And I asked him, how long do you think you're going to be in the role? And he said, 18 to 24 months. I said, well, then that's a different agenda than if you felt like you were going to be here 5 years. And of course, none of us have a crystal ball. But in his case, this was about preparing him for the future. And he had moved through several other roles. So he assumed that this would be a short-term assignment. So I think context matters. But as we have said so many times, and I know my team over the decades was tired of hearing me say this, but a problem well-defined is half solved. So I think you go into this new opportunity, it'd be really good if you'd give some focused time, energy, and effort to identifying the wins.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so you got a second thought for the listener who's going into something new. So I'm going to identify my wins. What am I trying to do? All that stuff. What do I need to do next?
Yeah, I think you need to listen. And this could be a blinding flash of the obvious. And so we may not want to dwell on this, but maybe you're like Satya did, and he needed to go on this listening tour for a year around the world. Maybe not. But are you being purposeful? Are you being strategic? Are you listening broadly? Are you listening to customers? Are you listening to employees? And even employees, are you listening to different generations and different levels? Are you doing focus groups? Are you doing one-on-one? Are you doing surveys? Are you doing field visits? My recommendation is to do all of that. Now, let me add a quick asterisk. I don't think that's just in transition, but I think it has heightened importance and priority when you're in a new role. I would encourage leaders, and have done this for years, that listening needs to be one of your core competencies. But for sure, when you go in, you've got to listen. There's a lot of wisdom, and there's a lot of experience, and there's a lot of information that you do not have. You've got fresh eyes, you've got perspective, you've got a pedigree and a track record and a resume and a skill set, but there's stuff going on in that new opportunity that you have no clue about.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'll give a little nuance to that. I think you said something a minute ago that a problem well-defined is half solved. You said something else through the years that I think applies here. One of the things that I've heard you say over and over that is that the people who are closest to the problems are many times closest to the solutions. And so on your listening tour, let's call it that, let's make sure we listen to some of those frontline workers, not just the people that are going to be reporting to us. I mean, we want to, in Satya's case, probably listen to people at all different levels. You're going to learn a lot as you begin to do that. And I would say one more little thing there about listening. This is a reminder I have to give myself. Let's listen. Let's make sure we listen with empathy. And I mentioned before, I started out this situation. We hadn't won a game the year before, or they hadn't won a game the year before. You can imagine the negative, like the skepticism, all that stuff. So a new leader here might be walking into a situation. Oftentimes there are challenges. That's why they've been given the opportunity. And so don't be surprised if you start listening and you start hearing negative things. And I always want to remind myself to guard my optimism. I don't want to, who doesn't go into a role in a positive mindset. I mean, you're not going to take a role if you feel bad about it or you're negative about it. Don't do that. But if you're really positive, don't be surprised if you go in and you start talking to people and all of a sudden they're describing things and it's not what you heard in the interview. It's not what you heard, that you've been recruited with a sales job here too. And so I think sometimes we can become a little jaded quick if we're not careful. So you just need to understand when you go in and start listening to people. Listen with empathy. It's been hard. You weren't there, so you really don't understand how things were, and it'll take time for you to become a part of that and for trust to grow. But I just think that listening is it's. I love that you say it's fundamental because it's such a multifaceted concept. To be a good listener, and it's something I'm constantly having to work on.
Let me give you one more example and recommend a book. We'll officially recommend a book in just a minute, but on this topic specifically, there's a book by Mike Abrashoff called "It's Your Ship." Fascinating story. Mike's a fascinating, dynamic, seasoned leader. He was a Navy officer, and he took the worst ship in the Navy and made it the best ship in the Navy in a matter of months.
He was the admiral.
And he did a lot of things. The book outlines and chronicles his journey. But one of the things that pertains to what we're talking about here is he interviewed every sailor. Now, I'm doing this from memory, but I think he had 300 sailors on the boat. And one of the questions he asked them is, what would you do to make this a better ship? And then he began doing the ideas, back to your point about those closest to the problem are often closest to the solution. But Mike is a great case study of what happens when a new leader proactively says, I'm going to listen. Oh, and by the way, we're going to respond to what we hear. So that'd be a fun read for some of you.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, so I think there's a couple more things that we can do here. Let's go to the next one. Let's look for untapped potential or opportunity. Anytime we walk into a new situation, there's a good chance that there's stuff that could have been done or hasn't been done. I mean, there's all kinds of untapped. Sometimes people, I mean, you think about it, it comes in all shapes and forms. There are opportunities for us to take things to the next level if we'll just pay attention. A lot of that attention paying probably is going to come when we start listening. Like we're talking about, these kind of build on each other a little bit. But I think so many times we go into a situation and we assume it has to stay the way it is. And I mean, I've heard you say for years, change is the job, right? And so many times untapped potential it might be our greatest opportunity there when we think about it. So
sure.
Talk more about that.
Yeah. And here's what here's just all I would add to that. It's not that we're smarter than the woman or man that we replaced, but we do have fresh eyes. And maybe we'll see a unique path or help conceive a new and different strategy, even if it's something that people have pursued before. I remember one situation where I had the opportunity to assume leadership for a team. The leader retired, and a lot of great stuff going on. Let me be really clear about that. But I asked a question one day about one of the resources that we created, which was optional. By the way, for those that don't know, I spent almost 45 years working for Chick-fil-A Incorporated. And this was when I moved into the training function. And there was a training resource that we were creating for the restaurants, and it was optional. And much of what we did at corporate was optional because the operators are independent business people, and I understand that completely. But I asked the question, how many people are using this resource? Because we were spending a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of energy creating this resource. And they said, well, we don't really know. I said, okay, well, can you go get an estimate, whatever method you want to use? I don't even care how you get it. Let's get a sense of how many people are using this, again, because we were spending a lot of money on this resource. And they came back and they said maybe 5%. I said, okay, well, then we're going to put that on our project list, right? Because there's untapped potential and opportunity there. And over time, with a lot of hard work by a lot of people, that resource was embraced by the majority of the restaurants. And so low-hanging fruit, right? Just an opportunity, fresh eyes. Let's take a fresh approach. And I think in most situations, if you're looking for those types of things, you can find them.
Yeah, I love that, Mark. That's fantastic. I want to give one more little thought, something I've actually done through my career when it comes to fresh eyes, because there are people who are listening here and they're not going into something new right now, or they might, and they'll be able to take this, and that'd be fantastic. But sometimes we get fresh eyes when we hire someone, when somebody else joins the team.
Yep.
One of the practices we always did was, if anytime you have somebody brand new, pull them aside after orientation and say, hey, I want you to pay attention for the next 10 days. And I want you to look for 4 or 5 things that you see that, and let's just have a discussion about it. 4 or 5 things that you think, why are we doing this? And it was always fascinating. Every time you'd go back and have that follow-up meeting, they would raise 4 or 5 questions, and you're thinking, man, I don't know why we do it that way. I mean, it's like you lose your fresh eyes when you've been there for a while, right? And so I think there's a way for us to embrace that concept, even if we've been there for a while, which I know that's a little bit off the conversation here, but I just want to remind you.
But
you get the ball.
Let me give you one more.
It was there.
Yeah, let me give you one more. If we're going to talk to existing leaders, there's still value in fresh eyes. So you can do a little role play, and I've used this many times over my career when you're talking to in-place existing leaders. Ask them this question. Pick some famous leader, if Jack Welch or Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or if some famous leader took your job next week, what do you think the first 3 priorities would be for them, or things that they would change? And you just do this scenario planning, this role, say, well, I know this about Gates and Jobs. And you can even pick some amorphous, unidentified leader. If a great leader took your job next week, what are the things that she or he would want to address immediately, on things they might want to change? And just that little mental exercise, I've never done that when it didn't surface ideas. So then, of course, the follow-up question is, well, why don't we consider those things rather than having to replace you?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That reminds me, I'll chase a rabbit here for a second. That reminds me, and I think it was in Culture Rules, you had a question, maybe it was in our field guide. We had the question, you're asking, let's say you're in charge of something, and you go back to our listening tour here, you go to someone and you ask them, if you were in my position, what's a couple of things you would do to improve our culture? There are all kind of questions here we could do, but I like that idea that we're asking some of those kind of questions to make our minds think about things, and then we can implement things and make things better. So that's great. Okay, so I know we've got one more little idea here that I think is important. If I go into something new, and this happened to me when I look back on the basketball thing, and this actually happened to me when I started Integrate. I think it was really important for me at some point to trust my experience. And I think for any leader going into something new, you got to trust your experience. There is a reason you've been given this opportunity. You have what it takes. You probably do have some fear and doubt and like, can I really do this? But there's a good chance that you've been given this because of your past experience, your track record, so to speak. And I think there's so much power in being able to just rely back on what are your fundamentals, what are your values, what are those core things that made you who you are to get you to this point. Do we always have opportunities to grow and get better? Of course we do. I mean, we're never there. You talked about last week the power of growing and having that mindset of being a lifelong learner. For sure, you're going to learn a lot as you take on a new role. But I don't want somebody to go into a new role and forget you have experience. You do have a track record, and I think you can lean on that when times get tough or when people may be complaining about the way it was or whatever. I mean, it's like you got to be able to work past that and believe that you can take it to a better place. I know you'll have some thoughts on that.
Well, just to agree completely, there are probably new skills, and there could be stretch assignments where you have to move beyond what you've done historically. But as you said, you've done some things that have enabled you to move forward, maybe move up, but certainly be given new and different responsibilities. I had trouble holding down a job. I worked all over the business, and I never asked for any of those positions. I was always given the next opportunity. So my fallback was, well, what have I done before that has worked well? Again, I don't want to oversimplify this, but for me, it was really 2 things. One is to help the people doing the work grow, whether it was teaching creativity to our communications team or bringing in folks to teach our consultants how to be better consultants. And in every role, I want to help the people doing the work grow. And then secondly, I always spent a disproportionate amount of time trying to discern what are the right things to work on. Because I was so blessed throughout my career. I had men and women on all of my teams who were going to do world-class work, but you don't get any credit for doing the wrong things well. So I guess I wore that strategic hat a lot. Let's be sure we're working on the right things. And so I just applied those 2 ideas over and over and over and over again for 45 years.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we've got four basically things that most of the people listening, again, they're not going to be the leader of the free world, but they probably are going to have new opportunities, and so when they go into those, we want them to identify the wins we talked about. We want them to listen and make sure that they're learning what they can to start with. They're looking for untapped potential, and then really the last one we could have almost said remember your wins. We said trust your experience. I mean, there are places where you've been successful. Let's lean into those. All right, so we've got several things there that people can try. One of the things that we said last week we wanted to try to do each week, Mark, was to review a book, to give a book recommendation. I know you and I are we're readers. We're trying to learn, and people everywhere we go and we do talks and keynotes, whatever. People always ask us, "Hey, what are you reading?" And what's on your list right now? You got a book you want to share with them today?
Sure. And this is a book I've been recommending ever since I discovered it. I don't know, maybe a decade ago. It's called Insanely Simple by Ken Segall. The subtitle is The Obsession That Drives Apple's Success. And Ken makes this audacious claim that he then works to substantiate throughout the book. And that is Apple's key to success was not Steve Jobs, which sounds like blasphemy to anybody who is a fan of Apple. You're going to go, well, of course it was Steve Jobs. Well, here's Ken's spin on it. It was not Steve per se. It was Steve's maniacal focus on simplicity. That is what has made Apple great. And I don't know how you take that, but I'm encouraged by that because I'm not Steve Jobs. I don't want to be Steve Jobs. I'm never going to be Steve Jobs. However, I'd love to learn from his experience. And again, Ken makes point after point after point after point in the book through real life examples. He worked with Steve for a decade. He was on the ad team that did the Think Different campaign. He's also done work for IBM and BMW and others, but he was in the room with Jobs for a decade. I'll share a couple of really quick stories. One, in 1997, when Jobs went back to Apple, they were floundering. Some of you know that story. And he asked the people, which products should I recommend that my friends buy? And he said he couldn't get a straight answer. So he basically slashed their product offering. He drew a 2x2 on the board and said, we're going to have consumer and professional, and we're going to have desktop and mobile. And he said, we're going to create one product in each of these four categories. It's like, that was genius.
Yeah.
But what was it? It was simplicity. Another example is when the early concepts came out for the iPhone. You got to remember the world we were living in. Some of you are too young to remember this, but there was a device called BlackBerry, and it had a full keyboard, just like your laptop, on this little device, little bitty keys. And so when the designers went to Steve with the idea for the iPhone, it had 3 buttons. And their logic was, well, people are going to use the phone to do 3 primary things. They're going to get on the internet, they're going to make phone calls, and they're going to access their music. And they said Steve would have none of it. He said, don't come back until you have 1 button. Now, of course, you look at your iPhone today, and I don't see any buttons here, right? They're all embedded. But I just think this is a powerful, powerful book. Simple sells, as long as you don't become simplistic. But it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of work. And I would argue it's actually harder than complexity. I think complexity is easy. Simplicity is really, really hard. It was Einstein that said, if you can't explain an idea well, you don't understand it well enough. I'll take that a step further for an idea regarding personal application. If I've got something complex to communicate, one of the questions I ask myself is, how would I explain this to a small child? Think 5-year-old. I've even gone as far as to find small children to try and explain my ideas, because I want everyone to find access to whatever it is I'm trying to communicate. So I love this book, and I think if you'll read it, you'll be a better leader.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. The only thing I'll add is I just blanket it. I think simple really is powerful. It's just I'm totally with you on that. I've got a friend who always says that you want to try to get to simplicity on the other side of complexity. You mentioned complex. There are going to be complex things, but even if it's complex, can you get on the other side of it to simple? Because again, you may not be explaining your stuff to a fifth grader or to a 5-year-old or whatever, unless you're a teacher. Maybe you are. They're really the best thinkers, maybe. But there's a good chance that the workers and the team members and the people, simple is it really is powerful. So I love that book.
Yeah. Now, let me offer a cautionary note. Simplistic is dead. You lose the whole game. If you I want to push on that line as simple as possible and no more. If you cross the line and it becomes simplistic, game over, you lose. So be careful. Be careful. It's a great and powerful idea, but you can't push it too far.
And as an author yourself, I mean, me, when I heard that, and I've read that book as well, Insanely Simple. It's just a great title, and it's just so good. It's really good. So yeah, that's a good recommendation. Okay. So Mark, we're going to leave it there today. I hope the president does a great job leading the country. I'm excited about seeing what's going to happen for any of our listeners who are going into something new. And we hear those stories. If you have any of those, reach out to us, info@leadeveryday.com. You can find us on our website at leadeveryday.com. Pick up a copy of Insanely Simple if you're looking to get past some complexity and trying to make things maybe more clarity for the people around you. That'd be great. If we can help you, please let us know. We're going to be back next week. Mark, I've got an article I ran across, and we've been discussing this. It's an article about young leaders, and actually one of our most downloaded episodes ever was a young leader episode. And so we're going to talk some next week to young leaders. And if you're leading younger leaders, I think you're going to love this conversation. It's going to be great. So I hope you'll join us for that. Please keep sharing with your friends and family. Hit the review button if you've not done that. Love that. We're also, just to remind everybody, these episodes are being dropped now on YouTube. We're at Apple, Spotify, if you're just wanting to listen. So you take your pick. Help us continue to spread the word of Lead Every Day. Remember, the best leaders really do lead every day.